Fantastic. Welcome everyone to using OpenAir outside of the system. This is a continuation in our expert user webinar series. And today we have a special guest, and I'll be introducing him briefly. So I'd like to introduce Godfrey Knowles from Reese. He has been a long-time user of OpenAir, as you can tell from this slide, since March of 2000. So he's definitely seen a huge evolution in the product. And he's in our Michigan region. So Godfrey, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your expertise and your company.
Sure. I guess when OpenAir first started off, we were the classic target market. We were the two guys in a laptop, as I've said a few times. And basically what we do is we're a professional services organization. We have about 30 consultants who do a variety of tasks, application development. We have consultants, we have data architects, we have enterprise architects, and we have a bunch of clients across many different verticals, and we seem to be doing an awful lot of mobile development lately. So I guess our skill set would be in defining requirements, usability, architecture and development itself, and we view ourselves as big picture people bringing it all together. Okay, so let's have a look at the agenda for today. So the agenda for today is, why would you want to look at the OpenAir database? Why on earth would you want to take this information and pull it out into a MySQL database, go to all that effort? After we get over that little hump, we'll talk about the database structure, what it looks like under the hood. A lot of what we do in our development expertise outside of OpenAir is we like to get under the hood and see what's happening in the different systems. So for us, OpenAir, the first thing that we try to do is we try to pull apart the tables and see what they look like. So what we're going to do is show you how to do that yourselves so that you can get a better understanding of how it's all put together. With that understanding, then you should be able to move on to do some simple reporting outside of OpenAir in the database, which is a MySQL database. And then we'll talk about what we've done to take this database information and aggregating it and putting it into simple dashboards into a data warehouse. I'll talk a little bit as well about how to actually download the database, where you need to go in OpenAir to enable that, what you need to do to set it up in MySQL, and then we'll talk about some tips and tricks that we found along the way, and we'll talk about resources and tools that you need about this. This is not going to be a very technical presentation, but I suspect it's from previous webinars, it's probably going to be more technical than what you guys have seen before, but I'll do my best to keep this as simple and as straightforward as possible. Okay, so why would you want to look at the database? Well, at the very least, it's all about backing up the data. The data is in the cloud, but there are several reasons why you might want to take a backup just to make sure that you can get at the data if you need to. Not saying that OpenAir is part of the Amazon snafu that happened last week, but just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean that it's going to be up there 100%, although OpenAir and NetSuite's record is pretty exemplary at the moment. But it's always better for safety to have a backup of the database. There may be reasons why people want to change the data. They may have made a mistake. You may need to be able to want to revert to a previous version of the data. So if the one thing that you take away from this is back up your data so that you can get to it if you really need to for whatever reasons, whether it's security or whether somebody's made an error along the way. So why else would you look at the database? Well, for back-end integrations. If you are using the integration manager, that's OpenAir's tool to import and export data into the database. People use that all the time for integrating with QuickBooks and for doing a manual integration with different systems. I know that there's been things set up with Sugar CRM and other PeopleSoft type applications. And Integration Manager is a very quick and easy way of getting in and out of the data in and out of OpenAir. But in order to do that, you need to know what the database structure is. If you want to update the data and do a mass update, it's important to know what the data looks like and how the tables are put together. For API development, if you want to do a bit more sophisticated, if you want to do real-time integration with OpenAir into other systems, into websites, you're going to need to start looking at the APIs that OpenAir have. There are two at the moment. There is an XML one and then there's a SOAP one. But if you or your development staff are looking to go down that route, in order for them to get a better idea of what they need to do, they need to start looking at the tables and the schemas and how it's put together to be able to make any of the API calls. If you want to, as I talked about a little bit earlier, if you want to create a simple data warehouse, you need to understand how the data is stored in the table so that you can pull it out and put it into whatever star schema data warehouse that you're trying to create. And also, from my perspective, I think my knowledge of OpenAir has grown by just looking at how the database is put together. Because if I can look at the tables, I can see, okay, now I understand why the purchase request is done in that way, because I can see that the way the tables are designed. Because the table is the framework for whatever the OpenAir website is based on. So if you can see what the relationships are at the database level, if that's what you want to do, then it really does help you get a better understanding of why the modules are separated out the way they are, and why something works in one way where it might not be that intuitive to you until you actually look at the database. Another reason why I started looking at the database and seeing if we could examine the data in greater detail was because, in my opinion, and of course this may have changed now with the reporting wizard, one of the least easy pieces of OpenAir to use is reporting. And if you are anyway SQL competent, and I don't know if many of you are on the call, then getting access to the raw data makes it much easier to do basic reporting outside of OpenAir. Okay. So the database structure, there are approximately 230 tables, and there are several thousand fields within the OpenAir database. The modules are, as you would expect, they look very like the modules in the website: timesheets, invoices, expenses, purchase requests, resources, opportunities, projects, proposals, and workspaces. And you can, there are other tables as well that cross these different modules, but they're the basic modules, which are the same as what you can see in the OpenAir website. Let's take a look at the Quick Data Dictionary, which is available online. Here is, as I said, there's 230 tables, and there's over 4,000 fields. Each of these different links will show you what the database looks like. Okay. So if you want to, at the very least, if you want to see what the data dictionary looks like, if you go to the URL that's on the slides, you can look into a lot of detail to see how it's all put together. What I tried to do is...
yeah, Godfrey, if I could kind of comment here. The data dictionary actually reveals some interesting information, even if you're curious, that like the database names of fields do not necessarily match directly with the user interface. So if you are going into that API world, that integration manager world, to try and extract data and stuff, you actually will get field names that are not familiar to you, because in the user interface of OpenAir you can rename stuff, and it's called expense report, not envelope, but in the database it's actually called envelope. So for those of you getting ready to sort of go down that track, just be aware that there's a few things that have a different name in the database.
Another good example of that is time bills. The time bills themselves are called slips within the database. They're not called time bills. For each of the modules, what I've tried to do is put together a little diagram to show you, to get you the first steps on the way to showing you how the database is put together. So here we have on the timesheet side, there's lots more tables involved, but the basic three tables that you need to look at are the timesheet, the task, and the time type. And they are linked. You can see that each of the different IDs is linked across. So within the task table, you have a customer ID, you have a project ID, a timesheet ID, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is probably gobbledygook until you see the actual data. So let's take a look at the actual data. Okay, so if we go within timesheets, what I'm trying to show here is all the different data within timesheets. This is data from our sandbox that we downloaded. You can see that this is the header detail for the timesheets. And then if we go take a look at the tasks, which are the different items, that would be the detail behind each of the timesheets. So this is the individual tasks that the person performed, which then gets rolled up into the timesheet itself. Okay. The next one is invoices. Invoices is made up of slips, so that's the time billed within the invoice, which is associated with the customer, which is also associated with the user who created that time bill in the timesheet, and that's also for each individual project. It's linked that way. I'm not going to go into to show you each of the tables at the database level for each of the modules, but what I'm trying to do here is give you an idea about how it's all put together, so that if you want to go off and look at this later on, you can go do it yourself. Expenses, we have envelopes, which are, as Jody said, are called expenses. The envelope are made up of tickets, which are the items within the expenses. The item is an item type, so that's mileage, whether it's faxing, what are each of the different expense items that you have. And reimbursement, it's linked to that, so you need to know if you wrote a check to reimburse the user.
So the interpreter, I'll be the interpreter. So envelope, like I said before, is expense item. Ticket is receipt.
Yes.
Okay. So you can see how obviously the system has been around for quite some time. There's been some terminology, user interface enhancements, and for those of you who have sort of worked with other people or worked with us, when we bring up our environment or a training environment, you know, even within UIs, between your UI and our UI, you may actually see some naming differences, and it's just the database never changes. That's the good thing. The user interfaces may change a little bit, and of course you also can change the interface. So there's a little bit of interpretation there.
The next one is a purchase request. So you have to set up the purchase request, then each of the purchase items, and then that's associated with a vendor. So it's pretty crystal clear why the user interface is designed the way it is when you look at what the database is underneath it for OpenAir. Okay, simple reporting. So let's have a look at some simple reporting. What I've done is take this information, export it to a MySQL database, and then we have a front end which is called PHP admin, which we're going to look at to see how the data is put together. Okay, so first one we're going to do is the number of users. So if I go to the users table.
And Godfrey, the tables that you're looking at, these are downloaded tables, so you're actually working with the raw data right now.
Yeah,
right?
I'm working with the raw data. You can see these are all the different 230 tables that we've downloaded. If I quickly just do a look at all the users, here's me in the first one, and then the number 2 in the company was a gentleman called Chris Sculthorpe, who's still with us. So if I do select count from user. Obviously, you're going to need to if you're not used to writing simple queries in SQL, you're going to need to be able to get your SQL for Dummies in order to be able to access the raw data and play with the raw data. Although what I will show later on is that it's quite straightforward to connect access to this. So you can play around with the data in Access and filter it and export it to Excel the same way as you would any other Access database. All you need to do is install MySQL and then create a bridge to Access. So as you can see here, with our SQL, select count from user, we found that there's 115 users in the database since we first started. Okay. Second one I was going to do is the number of custom fields created by a user. If we go and have a look at the custom fields table, you can see here that there's only actually 2 custom fields that we've created, so we haven't created a lot of custom fields in our sandbox. And the query that I'm going to do is got a join, so let me just create this. So what we're doing here is we're joining the user to the customer field, and we're seeing that the person who created the customer fields is my good self, Godfrey Nolan. This is useful if you want to see at any stage who created what custom field, who changed what tables when. So it allows you to do a little bit more than what OpenAir allows you to do by accessing the data from outside of the system. Okay, a much more complicated one, we're going to look at profit by user, which I'm not going to explain how the SQL works, but this will allow us to do some data warehousing. So that's what we're trying to do next. So let me just cut and paste this in here. Very briefly, what we're trying to do is do some calculations on the slip table to pull the data out. And if I look at the data, it will say, from these people, I know from this rate and what their cost was and what the time bills were, I can figure out what my cost was. And from my cost, I can determine what the profit is for each of these different users, which for us is crucial as a professional services organization. We're going to use that slightly later in our data warehouse. There are hidden goodies too as well. One of the things that, one of our issues that we have, one of the things that we do for our customers is we try to make sure that there is little or no swivel sharing, there's little or no double entry of data as we move along different systems. And for our payroll system, we have information for the actual cost that we have for our users, which is the wages and the workers' comp, FICA, et cetera, and our health benefits. And I was struggling for a way to put that into OpenAir, and we found that when we looked at the actual database that there are tables in there, the actual cost and cost type tables, which allow you to put that data in there. That's just one example of some of the information or tables that you can use within OpenAir. I'm sure there's probably other ones, but that one has been very crucial for us because it means that instead of having two systems support, now we just have one. So I can show you that briefly. So let's look at the cost type first. So we have benefits, fees, and wages. Fees are the, we use a professional organization where we rent our employees from and they charge us the fees, so everything's rolled up to that. And then we have wages too as well. So we have wages, fees, and benefits are our cost types. And if we go look at the actual cost, we can see for each of the different users what those fees are. So that allows me to create the query so I can see what the profit is for each of the different users. Okay. So, and here's just an example of how we use PHP MyAdmin to do the SQL. So now we create some simple dashboards. So if we take that query that I just showed you, and we export it to, here's some sample data for the time bills and the profits, which is data that if you use the query that we showed about how the profit is for each of the users, we can roll that information up, and then on a bi-weekly basis, which is how we do our invoicing, we can then tell what are the time bills and what are the profits for over that time period. There are plenty of data warehouses out there at the moment. One of the ones, the open source ones that people use a lot is Pentaho. What I'm going to show you today is I'm going to show you SAP's free server, which is the SAP Business Objects on Demand. And what we do here is we simply, oh, it's expired, hold on a second. We simply upload the Excel spreadsheet that we calculated from.
This always happens on live demos, Godfrey. Everyone knows this.
Okay. Well, what I'll try and show you then, let me see if I can get back to it when you're answering questions at the end. But essentially what we did is we took the profit and then we, because we know that this happens in live demos, we put a little image in here to show what the profit was for each of the different time periods that we calculated. And I obviously did this a while ago. So downloading the database. So downloading the database is, if you're using the new interface, you go into Administration, Global Settings, Integration, Import, Export. And if you're using the older interface, which is Account, Exchange, Import, Export. You export all the data in MySQL format, and you upload it into MySQL. So I'll just show you what it looks like on the next page for our sandbox. So it's, we actually click on the automatic backup service. And your choices there are text files, because you can export it as comma delimited, so you can export it straight into Excel, or as we're doing here, into MySQL, so we can analyze the data after we download it. The way that this is set up at the moment is that we're emailing it to myself, but on our live system, on our production system, we secure FTP it to a server, and it gets imported into that server. There are some extra steps that you need to take to get there, and I'm sure OpenAir support can help you, or if you get stuck, I'm more than happy to answer questions at a later stage. So downloading the database. Here's your bit, Jody. This is you. This is where you step in.
Yeah, so one thing that OpenAir takes pride in is data integrity and making sure that the data is secure. In fact, many of your organizations, before you went ahead to purchase OpenAir, had to make sure that they were SAS compliant, SAS 70 compliant, or perhaps if you're international, that they followed the EMEA or EU data security guidelines. So of course that is a very, very important thing to OpenAir. So the caution I have to put here is if you are taking the data out of the system, you are taking the data out of a secure environment. And so now the security becomes your concern. You have to make sure you're not throwing it out there on Facebook or anything crazy like that. And you are, if you're using the data in some capacity to do reporting and stuff, it may not hurt for you to actually check with IT if you are considering doing any kind of things like exporting it and putting in access and using it on your C drive, just to make sure from a company perspective the company feels comfortable with you taking that risk, that security onto your shoulders. For many of you, you're plugged into the network. You're already behind a firewall or VPN, so that's not a big concern. Or you're having to put stuff on shared servers, which are owned by the company. Not a big deal. But if you do have consultants and stuff that are traveling and they just and you want to download it onto your C drive, I would think that that might be a security risk. So you just may want to check with your IT department before you start going down this path to extract and put into an open database.
Okay. Yeah, I'm the administrator on an OpenAir database, and I'm also one of the main people who work with the data once it gets outside of OpenAir, although there are a couple of people who do that too, so you just got to be really careful about who you give access to this data because they can see everything. So resources and tools. Once you download it from OpenAir, what do you do with it? I've given a little script there. Essentially what you need to do is install MySQL. That comes from mysql.com. Download it, install it, and then you start up the command line tool, and I've given you the 4 statements that you need to do in order to upload the database into your MySQL. That's assuming that when you get the data that you extract it into your temp directory as shown. The tools that we typically use is the best one for the most adventurous would be Toad, which comes from Quest Software. They actually give away a free front end for MySQL. Toad software is quite an expensive piece of software for Oracle. It's typically used for Oracle. But to get you into their universe, if you start using MySQL, they give away free access to their Toad software, which is great. You can do all sorts of data modeling. You can do all sorts of indexing. I suppose that is one thing that I should say. Although the data that you get from the OpenAir database is not indexed, there are no relationships set up in the data that you get. So sometimes you have to rebuild them yourselves if you want to do something afterwards. PHP MyAdmin is the free front end that I just showed there, which is a very friendly front end for people who are not quite as SQL savvy. Pentaho is an open source free database warehouse. If you want to start aggregating your data, I know that at last week's conference I met one person who had created their own data warehouse out of the OpenAir data, and I'm told that there are many people who have done that. So we started using Pentaho to do that, to take the data out, and then over months and years, because we have such a huge amount of data, we can see what our trending has been for sales and for users and for companies over that time, which is important data for a lot of people as you try to strategize over what's going to happen in the next few quarters. SAP On Demand, although I didn't get in there, SAP On Demand is a great way if you want to play around with data warehouses for taking the data out of OpenAir. It's a free system to get you into the SAP world. It only works with 2 dimensions if you know data warehouses, but it's great for getting started. It's very visual. It's very easy to use. And then I have connected with Access. So once you download your MySQL database and have it set up, there is a bridge that you can create, which is called ODBC, between your Access database and the SQL database. So if we look at this, we can see that if I go back to actual cost, it's not in there. It's the account. We have the account information. That is us in Southfield. Let's have a look at some customers. Oops. per customer table. So this is, you can see, you can use access to get to this information if that's what you're more comfortable with, and then you can of course export that into Excel and play with it there. Okay, so summary is the reporting limitations can be addressed without Excel downloads, that you can pull this information in and then access it using whichever one of your favorite MySQL front ends that you want. There are simple and free tools available to build your own dashboards. And then I'm sure Jody will tell you about if anybody has any questions to post to LinkedIn if they want more information. Okay.
The conference has been unmuted.
So great. Thank you so much, Godfrey, for all of that. And while I open it up for questions, if you want to try to figure out how to get back into SAP on demand, I'm sure some people would like to do that. So I do realize that this presentation was not so much about feature functionality and use within OpenAir. It was a much more technical and expert series on how to manipulate data outside of OpenAir. But many of you are actually interested in that, so I thought it would be very beneficial. And Godfrey mentioned this topic. I said, I've run into so many customers that just wish they could pull the data out, and you're doing it right now by downloading like detail reports in many cases, and there's other options available. So I know Godfrey is always willing and welcoming questions and advice in this area. So with that, I'll open it up to questions after I do my little spiel. Obviously, many of you have been coming to these expert webinars. This is the 7th month. We started a new set and have published a new set up until the end of the year of expert webinars that we are planning to do out there on our website. Last week being Sweet World, we met many of you for the first time in face-to-face on the West Coast, which was a great show. Definitely a much smaller focus on OpenAir simply because it was NetSuite and everything else, but it was the broader audience brought a different perspective to things. However, we are still out there focused on OpenAir. So if you don't know already, there is an OpenAir users LinkedIn group that you are welcome to join. We're using that to exchange information, and of course your Godfrey participates in that, so if you have questions specifically for him, you can throw that out there on LinkedIn and everyone can benefit from that knowledge. We have top step tweets. We retweet weekly tips on how to use OpenAir. I do a weekly blog. And of course, we also advertise these monthly webinars. So we do really appreciate everyone's patronage and following us along the way as we continue to try and deliver you knowledge that will benefit your use of the system. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions if anyone has a question for either of us. Obviously, Godfrey was the main presenter here, so I'm sure most of your questions are for him. So if anyone has a question, feel free.
Hey, Jody, it's Steve Holton here.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
I have two questions for probably Godfrey. The first is one of the things he mentioned was he was using this he was going into the tables directly for doing mass updates of data, and I'm just wondering kind of how if he has concerns around any referential integrity with all of those different tables and doing the mass updates, or is his knowledge of all of the tables so in depth that when he does updates he maintains that any referential integrity that's needed?
Okay. Well, the simple answer to that is you got to test, and test again. So do it on your sandbox first. Make sure it's working in your sandbox, and then move it over to production. But probably what you'll find as you get into this, the actual database structure is relatively straightforward. It's well normalized. It's well designed. It's pretty easy to figure out what the different links are between the different tables. So if you're used to doing that, referential integrity is not an issue.
Okay.
What was the second question?
Second question, well, actually, probably you probably answered. I was wondering if there was like a database map that besides just the list of all the 230 databases that would actually show some of that those connection points. But I think you indicated that it's probably pretty straightforward and just a matter of digging through it and doing our own queries to to make sure?
It would be really nice if there was a published DRD, published schema design with the different links. But essentially, if it's a user table, it's ID, and if that user ID is referenced in any other table, it's called user_ID, and that's how the database is built up. But there's no, I've yet to see a schema with the entire ERD. It would be nice to see that, but I think it's, I couldn't find one, and it's just up to ourselves to import it into Toad or whatever and get that to do the hard work for us. But really, there's a bit of grunt work required in order to get to there.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
And Godfrey, I have a question on chat. Someone asked, how does that import work into Access? You download it into the MySQL, but then is the ODBC import part of Access, or is there something else that you have to download?
What you have to do is, if you're used to setting up, you need to find somebody who's used to setting up ODBC connectors. But what you need, once the MySQL database is set up, you have to go into Access and download the driver for MySQL, which is very straightforward. And then you need to set up an ODBC the same way as if you're connecting Access to a different database, and then it will just either pull in the data or you can talk to it directly. I'm more than happy to help with somebody if they have any problems or they can't find an IT resource to do that for them. It's probably about a 10-minute job.
Okay. Other questions from the participants? Okay, and Godfrey, you actually had a contact us slide with just your email address, and I took that out, I think, by accident. Would you want to share that with anyone?
Yeah,
just type it in one of those.
I put it right in the start. Hold on, I'll put it back in there.
Because now that you've gone through it, I'm sure everyone's like, oh, well, so how do we get a hold of you? So
yeah, the best way to get me is always by email. It's godfrey@reese.com. And I'm more than happy to answer questions or to talk to other people who've done this and have got a bit further than me or have done slightly different pieces to collaborate to try and do other things with APIs and data warehouses.
And I'm 95% sure you're probably the most experienced person with OpenAir on this phone call because you've been with it the longest. So I know you've certainly been with it longer than I have, so I really appreciate you joining in this expert webinar series. It's been great.
No problem. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.